move on to Perelandra, the second in the sci-fi trilogy, and dealing with an entirely different planet. Obviously, the first one was Malacandra, which was very much like Mars, or is Mars, because in the old solar language, which is the common tongue from among all the planets, they speak special languages, but they also speak a common tongue, which they call Old Solar. And in the common tongue, Mars is Malacandra and Venus is Perelandra, and sometimes the title of this is Voyage to Venus. And that's interesting insofar as the Venus is the goddess of love, and the theme and the significance of love is very important in Lewis's fiction across the board. And the Voyage to Venus will not only be based on a planet associated with the goddess of love, we will meet the prime figure there, the Green Lady, who has associations with a sort of love which is not broken as a consequence of sin. Not yet. So in the four loves, Lewis describes four different types of earthly loves, one of which is not like the other, the Agape Love. And it is, again, an illustration on his part of devolution as opposed to evolution. Remember, I talked about that when we were in person last time. The way in which the highest form of love actually norms and corrects and to some degree cures the sinfulness of the three earthly kinds of love that we do experience. Familial love, friendship love, erotic love, and finally the love of God. The love of God is the one that actually corrects the loss of integrity in the other kinds of love caused by sin. But the Green Lady represents Venus without sin. So love as it ought to be. She loves God. She lives in a continuous relationship with him. Mal-Eldil speaks to her directly. She hears his thoughts expressed to her. That's a very interesting portrait. And again, if you want to see this as a theme across Lewis's fiction, I said last time you can contrast her, the Green Lady, with not so much the White Witch, but with Jadis in the Magician's Nephew, who seems to me to represent Astarte. So again, that's Aphrodite, but in a different mythology. So it's a form of erotic love which is self-absorbed and utterly broken. So that love is not only marked by sexual promiscuity, but also abortion and so forth. So just totally disordered erotic love, which is characteristic of the Canaanite gods in the Old Testament. So it's a sort of using of the categories of Aquinas's and more particularly Augustine's theology, and reading the Old Testament using that is the way I see it. And Lewis is reintroducing it because in his day and in our day, love has been reduced once again, not to a goddess so much, but rather to a lower motivation, not a higher motivation. So we don't worship goddesses. There are no or very few attempts to reestablish Aphrodite temples, but there are regularly temples to pornography, promiscuity, and so forth. They're not literally temples, but there are practices in accordance with that. So it's the worshiping of lower drives to explain the higher actions. He says this is characteristic of our reductionist, materialistic age. And to some degree, in that reductionism, psychology effectively replaces metaphysics and theology. And if it's not psychology, then it would be something visual. Again, it would be something like genetics. So Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The Selfish Gene. few decades ago, in which he claimed that our motivations for action were subconscious. So we're motivated by genetic drives to procreate with people who our genes somehow, without our knowing, were identifying as good ways of propagating themselves. So it's sort of like the way I remember at the time the first installation of Star Wars, what do you call those? The metachlorians. It's the worst thing ever. What motivates the Force, which is above us and around us and in us? It's not just pantheism. Now it's sort of it's a materialistic. So it's not a sort of a Buddhism explanation. Now it's a biological explanation. For me, it just destroyed the whole fantasy series right there. Because it began then, instead of a sort of a sense of transcendence, it was just the reduction to, yeah, he's got, oh, look at the midichlorian count. It's the highest I've ever seen. Oh, wow, this is great. Oh, destroys the whole series right there. One fell swoop. And it doesn't matter if you add a female character in afterwards, she's just got a higher midichlorian count. Okay, whip-de-doo. You destroyed it with the one. Like, as soon as you reduced it to a material, the whole sense of the mystery is gone. Anyway, Lewis is trying to deal with this here in Perelandra, and it's not, those of you who observed, it sounds a lot like Paradise Lost. I think you are entirely correct. He's writing his preface to Paradise Lost around the same time, which, if you've read, is quite brilliant. And he's deeply engaging with that concept. But here we also face another unfallen world. So the difference between this Perelandra and Milton's Paradise Lost is this paradise will not be lost, although it could be. So that's what drives the plot, is the temptation, the tempter, the nature of the temptation, and the consequences that would ensue thereby. So I'm not going to read this in class, but it's a little bit like Tolkien's Silmarillion, which similarly tells an account of the fall. Right in the beginning, at a sort of a very basic level. It happens very early on. But here, as I say, the fall is avoided. And I'm just going to give a little summary of the plot, a little synopsis, and then I want to focus on the first few scenes because they seem to me very important in trying to rectify the flattening effect and reductionist effect of materialist sensibilities and the explanation for action. So as I say, if you don't think that God is orchestrating everything, if there's not providence, if the categories are not higher that we conform to, then you need to find an explanation for it somewhere. If it's not higher, then it's going to be lower. It's not going to be no cause. You can't just appeal to the mechanism. You'll come up with a psychological explanation for it, which you won't understand. Freud will appeal to, an Oedipus complex or an Electra complex or whatever, and religion is effectively a displaced form of sexual desire, and so forth. You're always going to appeal to some base instinct. Everything we call love is effectively lust in disguise. So the beginning of the story, Ransom is now sent, and it's more, and this becomes more explicit as the series goes on. At first, remember, he was captured against his will. He was completely oblivious to what was going on. As the series progresses, he becomes more aware of intervention, supernatural intervention. Right? In the first one, not so much. He slowly is being acquainted with himself, and along with Ransom, the reader is being, I would say, disoriented from the reductionist materialism and reoriented towards a healthier perspective, at least from Lewis's point of view. So that and I mentioned that book that essay by him, oh, what's it called again? The shoot. The translation. Transposition. It's the transposition that is what is going on here. So rather than an evolutionary viewpoint, he presents a devolutionary viewpoint in all areas. And he's consistent in that. But it takes time to reorient the reader. So that the character of Ransom is undergoing a process which we, the reader, are also. It's shifting our categories so that we start to see the hand of God in all things. The comment or question? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess my question is, if you remove the Imago Dei perspective, then would this, as you put it, the flattening or reductionist perspective, it's kind of like saying that humans are no different than animals. We're just maybe more evolved.
Yes.
Higher cognition.
Yes.
Simply it.
Capacity for reason. Yeah. That's pretty much it. And so that's a good, I'm glad you brought that up. And yes, that's effectively what it is. I just dealt with this actually in my last class, seemingly unrelated, which was a modest proposal by Swift. And Swift, I observed there, presented his proposal, which, if you recall, was to eat babies, in terms of the rational nature of the proposal. It would solve the root cause of the problem, which was poverty, which we hear in politics right now. They always talk about, well, yeah, people did this terrible act. We got to stop the terrible act. So we can do that through bringing in, hiring more police here in Toronto. We're going to, there's all sorts of crimes on the subways, as we know. And so we need to have more police. Well, that will keep the crime from, hurting citizens. But then there's another point. Yeah, okay, this is a problem. Let's acknowledge it. But there's a bigger problem here, which is what drives people to this. Let's get to the root cause of that, which is poverty. And the solution then is always the communist one of wealth distribution. You just give people, and then it'll solve the problem. I think that this is a stupid response, but not irrational. It just doesn't really go deep enough. It's not a material, but if you're a materialist, every problem is material and every solution is material. So the root cause to a materialist of all problems is material solutions. And it's not just they think there's a deeper way, but they object to the police response, because the police response suggests a right and a wrong. And a right and a wrong, again, points outside material causes to a moral order and so forth. So you'll notice that in contemporary political debate, just here locally now, that is already immediately being proposed here. But the Imago Dei, very important in this. Yes, the idea that we're rational animals is important in the first installment, where the scientist Weston proposes this about human nature, that yes, we have bigger brains, we are more evolved than other creatures, and therefore we ought to evolve from them. And it doesn't matter if he experiments on Ransom or takes him against his will, which he acknowledges is wrong, but the justification is the greater good. So the individual can be sacrificed to that. And in fact, he goes beyond that and says it doesn't matter if 1 million are sacrificed to that. In fact, there's no limit to the sacrifice he's willing to make. It's the same logic that we saw in Frankenstein. Right? Progress means that we're going to have to crack a few eggs. If we're going to make an omelet, that's going to have to happen. Like, as Stalin says, a death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths are statistics. Because to some degree you recognize, and this is why journalists, when they want to demonstrate to people the atrocity, they will focus on an individual. But if you see a big crowd getting mowed down, it doesn't really actually have the same emotional effect. You don't identify with the crowd, you identify with the person. Right? But it's funny that. and distorting to some degree. And we have difficulty conceptualizing atrocities on a massive scale, which is partly why they can happen. But at the individual scale, it really does matter, and then it does bear on the very point that you said, do we bear the Imago Dei or not, individually? Now, on this planet of Perelandra, just like on Malacandra, they are now, Lewis's word, H-N-A-U. All rational, sentient creatures are now. That doesn't mean that they bear the image of God, because it's only human beings that bear the image of God. That will come clear later on in the story when we talk about Mal-Eldil and his son and how he took on the form particular to our planet. So all of these planets are being presented as foils for what happens on the silent planet, which is our planet, where the fall did happen, but here it hasn't happened. And how is it going to happen here? Well, Ransom is, as I say, directed here by an angelic power of some sort to Perelandra. And there we find a very different landscape. It's very fluid and mobile, and the islands are not grounded like ours. They're literally tossing in the waves like a surfboard. And they move further and further apart, sometimes together. That's how the Green Lady got separated from her husband. Like she doesn't know where he is. It leads to a comic scene at the beginning when she thinks that Ransom is the Green Man. She's very excited, waving at him, and then she realizes that it's not him, it's just Ransom, and her face falls, and she's very disappointed. And it's pretty funny. But she's the equivalent of Eve in this Garden of Eden. The nature of the prohibition here is not the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's not the prohibition. The prohibition on this world, remember it's a fantasy world, is that she cannot stay overnight on the fixed island. It says there's one place in the whole of the fixed land, or the lands that move, where she may not reside overnight, and that's the fixed island. And she's not going to do it. And so the nature of the temptation is to get her to do that. By the way, Perelandra is the third planet, the third heaven. A lot of discussion of that here, at least allusion. I don't think Lewis tries to make too much of it, but Paul the Apostle talks about being taken up to a third heaven. And that'll come later in the story, where Perelandra is being suggested that he was here in that sense. I don't think Lewis means it too seriously, as in that the Apostle Paul somehow ended up on planet Venus or something like that. I don't think that's, it's more of a, it's yeah, anyway. But the figures that are there are different than before. Now the tempter is the scientist. And the difference is that there's a man with her, but the man is not the Green Man, it's Ransom. Ransom is there in a way that Eve had no man present with her. Here she does. Here she has Ransom. Ransom's problem is that he is not like the Green Lady. He is a sinner, and he is subject to the consequences of the fall in his own world. He needs to sleep. He gets tired. His rational faculties are not as advanced as they ought to be. And he doesn't want to do the right thing. So there's a conflict within him to obey or to flee, and so there's a lot of internal reflections on what could be and what would not be. So if he does this, this will happen, and if he doesn't do this, and what the nature of the temptation will be, and what if he doesn't do this. Lots of internal monologue going on in this, which I find fascinating myself. So Weston, and I'll come to this later, Weston the scientist is also different than the previous work. In that work, he was the Enlightenment scientist like Frankenstein. Did not care about life at all. denied the validity of religion across the board or spiritual insight, was willing to sacrifice all life. That's the Frankenstein typical scientist. H.G. Wells portrays more or less the same thing. Here there's a different twist on it. Weston develops spirituality. And he's going to correct the old Weston. He says that he knows more now than he used to. He sees that it was now wrong of him to reject all the claims that he believes Ransom was making to him about spiritual authority, etc. He now believes there is legitimacy to those appeals. And so he will appeal to a higher form of spirituality and think that that's the common ground on which he and Ransom stand. And at that point, we then get into a different dimension than we found on the previous planet. On the previous planet, there was little sense of theologically driven dialogue. It was addressing anthropological problems. It was addressing some of the linguistic features, but it wasn't really getting to the problems of theology. Here it really starts to do that. As Ransom will say, not all spirits are the Holy Spirit. Your spirituality is welcome but insufficient. If you're simply appealing to spirituality to get you out of this problem, you have to realize that there's a deeper, darker problem here. And so that it breaks into that. Now, he had already brought it up in the last work. Remember where he was on the fence and one leg's dark and the other leg's light, and the one feels like it, which is a funny old thing, but it is a sense of good and evil about the transgression there. It wasn't because he was in the presence of evil. It was because he was in the presence of something important going on there, because there was a spiritual power in which he was encountering on the light side. Remember, the light side is actually the side where he's not supposed to go, or he feels he should not go. Like, he doesn't go from the light to the dark. He goes from the dark to the light. He's entering in the presence of something numinous, something holy. In other words, God is drawing him even back out of the silent planet into this cosmic adventure, which the three human characters are oblivious to. And he is oblivious to. And Lewis is oblivious to. By the way, Lewis is the character we meet at the beginning narrating. He concluded the last one. He introduces this one. We have Lewis and we have Ransom talking. And there will be a moment in which there's a handover and Lewis disappears and Ransom will take over. But at the beginning, there's a great deal of discussion. That's where I'm going to focus this lecture, on that sense in which Lewis is trying to break through this sense of the reductionism and introduce an idea of a presence which defies our categories. And we'll look at how he does that in the narrative. I just wanted to mention one book, this one, Flatland, which he read, and which he found very thoughtful. I mentioned it last semester, when talking about transposition, this use of perspectivalism in drawing. How do you spell this? I know this is not how. We'll take this one. Yeah, that's annoying. I already turned it on. Is that it? That's it. So the way in which, in terms of even in the level of, oh, I thought it was on. I saw it for 2 seconds. There it is. The way in which you can depict 3 dimensions on a flat surface. It's through shade and color and right. So this looks 3-dimensional, in which a hand is drawing another hand. And the hands seem to jump off the page. That idea of 3-dimensionality to a two-dimensional object, the flat page. How do you convey a sense of three-dimensionality. We're three-dimensional creatures, right? How do we convey that in art? Through this. Lewis is trying to display four-dimensionality to three-dimensional creatures who want to think in terms of time and place and distance, right? Height, width, and depth. How do you convey depth? Here's how. Lewis is trying to convey a fourth dimension, that of the metaphysical, the spiritual, to a three-dimensional readership, who are also accustomed to seeing everything in two dimensions, not only three, just flattening it down. I take this artistic movement, this is Escher, the drawing hands, to be trying to do the same thing in the realm of art, to convey a sense of three-dimensionality, because there's a tendency culturally to reduce and flatten life to two dimensions. And there are different ways of doing that. If you think about painting, the Impressionists try to do the same thing through their painting. We'll deal with, this is as good as any. Three-dimension, but also murkiness. The murkiness, there's something there that to some degree contradicts the flattening effect of your eye. The eye has, so if I cover one eye, I lose the sense of dimension. I can see flat, but I don't have the sense that two gives of depth. This does the same thing by putting darkness, a dark boat in the foreground and the sun in the background and the light coming forward, so you get the sense of depth. But there's a vagueness about it, right? This is appealing, it's trying to give that, it's pushing back on a cultural tendency to reduce. Lewis is doing it now, but he's adding a fourth dimension to it. That's what's going on in this book. So that's part of the transposition. I suggested it last semester, and it's his way of combating evolution, not as a biological theory, but as a tendency, a reductionist tendency, which excludes the spiritual as nonsensical, and we'll try and explain it all away. Like God is just a sublimated sexual drive or something like that, as Freud suggested. Or Jordan Peterson will present it as the highest ideal, human ideal, whatever, and it's a symbol of everything good and true and beautiful. We create that. Lewis isn't having that, because this is directed, the whole narrative is directed by spiritual forces that are outside of him, and not only are they there, he doesn't like them. He's resistant to them. That aspect is very important to this. So there's the dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual, which we have, he tries to obliterate that. He tries to blur the line between it, because he's going to talk in spiritual terms that are also simultaneously physical. And the fight which Ransom will have to undertake to defend the Green Lady will end up being not just a spiritual battle of wits. He's going to have to put Weston down, and that means kill him to stop the temptation from happening. Now, he's not suggesting this is the way we deal with our battles on planet Earth. That's a false analogy, right? He's not an idiot. But he is saying in this context, and so and note the dialogue that he's habituating himself. This is an unfallen world in which there is no effective dichotomy between thought and action. The two are held together in some ways. And in some sense, this would be the original understanding, and he's getting this from Owen Barfield, of how poetic diction also works. So when the gods come in, they're divinized forms of action. And so if you read Barfield, like in his poetic diction, he criticizes the logical positivism of his day that reduces everything to the lowest common denominator, and doesn't recognize that there is something of that. And he uses the example of ruach in Hebrew being wind, but also breath. And it's the presence of God as well. All of these things are connoted in that. We're going to say, which one was it? and we're going to tend to, the Red Sea, the part of the Red Sea, but okay, well then a naturalistic explanation. Well, there was this gale force wind that blew a passage through for a time, and then it's explaining a naturalistic explanation. I think, no, but that's not the way they understood it, that God spoke. And so there's a tendency in Barfield and other to want to find that that's how poetic language actually works. It pulls together what we have separated and no longer associate together as part of the same experience. So when God speaks and the world comes into being, he does genuinely speak, but there is more than that involved in speech than we normally associate with speech. So it's a conceptual shift, and language is an important part of it. This is very important for Tolkien. Remember, the creator of languages, and the etymologist who wants to find the roots and the stories behind the stories and the roots of this. When Lewis wrote Barfield in 1929, he said this about a conversation he had with Tolkien. You might like to know that when Tolkien dined with me the other night, he said, apropos of something quite different, that your conception of the old ancient semantic unity had modified his whole outlook, and that he was almost just going to say something in a lecture when your conception stopped him in time. It is one of those things, he said, that when you've once seen it, there are all sorts of things you can never say again. And I would say that Barfield's work influenced both men, their view of what language does and how it does multiple things. Will help them fight the logical positivism, which is again part of the reductionism. And you'll note in 20th century, sorry, I'm going all over the place here, but in 20th century philosophy, it's all called the linguistic turn. That's the modern philosophy is characterized by the linguistic turn, associated with Martin Heidegger, among others. And these two men, Tolkien and Lewis, are fundamentally in opposition to it. I think it's deeply problematic. They think it's not only wrong, it's fundamentally absurd because it eliminates meanings from the framings of truths. And we've already said, but I'll say it more at greater length, in The Abolition of Man, that's exactly the issue. You say the waterfall is sublime. The other says that it's merely pretty. Coleridge is disgusted that somebody says it's pretty and not sublime because he thinks there's something more important. The teacher just says when they say it's sublime, they're merely talking about their feelings. And the word merely means this is inconsequential because it's a matter of meaning to them personally, but we can discount all of that. Meaning doesn't matter. Words talk about the objective reality of things, but the meaning is not part of that. Lewis and Tolkien say, oh no, you're wrong. The meaning comes along with the naming. And remember, that was the issue that the Hirasa spoke to Ransom about when he was talking about the fact they only had sex once in their lives, and then they wrote poetry about it, celebrating this one act, and they were waiting for it the whole lot. And there was a lead up to it. There was the moment, and then there was poetry and anthologies written. Same with the hunting of the of this beast. Their whole lives were waiting for this moment. They were in preparation for it. It was kill or die, and then there would be whole epic accounts of this moment. And so their life was infinitely meaningful, and the actions were connected to the meaning of the actions. It's a way of Lewis exposing how our actions seem to be divorced of all meaning. That's part of the flattening effect of modern reductionism. People think that their lives are dissociated from all meaning. God doesn't care about them. Their brains in vats. Things happen arbitrarily, whimsically, by chance, because materialism has no room for meaning or purpose. They can take their lives or live them on the whim, on the whim of an instant, and it doesn't matter and nobody cares. Lewis is trying to inject meaning into all actions, and he does that not only through the providential ordering, which he first doesn't understand and grows more and more significant as the three works evolve, but he's reorientating the reader to see things that way as well. So it's more than a theological explanation, it's a worldview change. I just started a Substack on this point. I didn't really get into it too much, but it's everyone says mere Christianity and his apologetics work, these are very important. I think the abolition of man is more important because it's a worldview change that's going on. It needs to be you need to be reoriented to the fact that there is a spiritual reality in all things that's driving these things. I think he's correct. Comments or questions at this point before I get into the work itself? So he's trying to broaden and give a fourth dimension to what artists are doing in the realm of painting in 3 dimensions. As they flatten in a romance of many dimensions is helpful in this regard. Lewis read and admired it. In the first work, Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom is a sort of he represents us. Like where we begin. We begin in a materialistic, reductionist universe. He sees things really with a mind that is not experienced spiritual realities at all, let alone interstellar travel. Now, he's a different man now. He's no longer our representative. He's changed. He's deeper. And now he needs to widen the world. And the plot begins as somebody who has been acquainted with the beings of Malacandra and thereby with unearthly powers. So there are spiritual powers that transcend those of H.G. Wells's fiction entirely. That evolutionary cosmology I spoke of. Now we're talking about other powers. And so the way he comes out at this time is we are introduced in a way you would think, why wasn't this in the first novel? Well, it was at the beginning. It was at the end of the first, but he is there at the beginning of the second novel. Lewis himself comes into the story, who got involved at the end of the first story, and here is summoned to help Ransom on his second voyage. And Lewis is not in terms of narrative perspective, he is not an omniscient narrator. He is confused by what he hears as well. So again, he does to some degree represent us. He's telling the story, but he doesn't quite understand. And just like the reader doesn't quite understand how to conceptualize what is going on here. And so it's a process. Lewis recognizes that there's a need to sort of baby walk us through that process. But he immediately gets plunged right into the realm of the marvelous. And it immediately becomes more theological. As I say, in the first one, if he started off with a theologically driven plot, I think people would have said this is only for people who agree with him, and he's starting us off too far down the road. We're not there yet. Now we are closer to accepting that that is plausible given everything that happened in Out of the Silent Planet. Now we can contemplate, since there are spiritual powers, what are the nature of the spiritual powers and how does that work exactly? It's already been dimly alluded to in the first, but now he gets into it much more deeply. So the angelic Eldils, Oyarsa, whom we met in Malacandra, and his fellows, at first are introduced in thoroughly material terms. And that's in keeping with, again, the reductionist mindset. How do I conceptualize to people who are accustomed to having an evolutionary perspective and seeing everything flat, a being that transcends that? Well, you do it in physical terms. So he says this, their physical organism, if organism, it can be called, is quite unlike either the human or the Martian. Remember, the Martians are the Sorns and the Pfiffeltrigi and the, what are they called? Hrossa. Those are the Martians. But there's another being there who seems to be there and not there, present and at the same time somewhere else. And those are the Eldil and the archons, the rulers there. How do we describe those beings? Because they don't have they're not material beings. There's something clearly that transcends it. So they're physical organism. If organism it can be called, it's quite unlike either the human or the Martian. They do not eat, breathe, or suffer natural death. And to that extent resemble thinking minerals more than they resemble anything we should recognize as an animal. So you know that, is it, there's an old game, is it animal, vegetable, mineral? Which one of it is? Is it? You would have thought it would be closer to animal, because animal's the higher of them. He says it's closer to the mineral. What? Like, that's a lower form, not a higher form. Like, because mineral down here, then vegetable, because it grows, it has, you know, a life and vitality to it. It's a sensory thing. And then animal will, you know, it can move itself. And these things are going to move, yes, but it's closer to the mineral. Now, the idea of thinking minerals is a total category mistake in our conceptualization, right? But Lewis goes there. It's not as accurate as making the reference to angels, because we immediately associate angels with going on. So why does he talk about thinking minerals? Well, it comes a page later. It's a wise tactic. It's a tactic to some degree. Page later, Lewis describes his involvement in Ransom's mission to Venus as in these terms. He says, "Here we were, both getting more and more involved in what I could only describe as interplanetary politics." He's sucked into a larger divine plan in which there's two sides at war with one another. And it seems to involve the whole cosmos. Again, think of the old cosmology, which again is related, where there's influence and so forth. Backdrop for this. That's not the only way he could have described it. He could have made explicit theological references at this point. He could have used even church historical examples. He chose not to do that because, again, he doesn't want to put off his readers who are not already Christian. They're going to object. This is a novel for these people at this, and I'm not. So this is obviously for a Christian audience. He makes the references. I'm not on board with that. He wants to take them to that point. They're not. So he's going to do it step by step. How does he describe the Eldils? Well, he calls them creatures, alien in kind, very powerful and very intelligent. And if he'd used theological categories, he would have not been able to go there, because he talks about them as alien in kind, which sounds ominous. The word alien in Latin just simply means another, just another. We associate alien immediately with hostility. You even use the word illegal aliens, illegal others. What makes them aliens? Well, they're from another place. They're not from here. Does that make them a problem for us? It shouldn't in one sense. It's just nationality. But there's an immediate sense of a different type of form of life here, which gets brought in here. And the power and the intelligence just associates it with the grand lunar. Right? So it has that very strong, threatening, ominous tone to it, which we can't miss. And it's the very same thing he emphasizes in the presence of Aslan. Aslan also is good, but he's not a tame lion. He's a threat. Do not mistake his goodness for the absence of threat. You are very much at risk in the presence of Aslan. And yet, at the same time, you have a being who is benevolent and wants good for you, but in his nature there's something very different here that you must not reduce to just a lion. Not that a lion isn't sufficiently threatening either, but Lewis tries to then break, or at least blur, the boundaries between depth and presence through blurring the boundaries between theology and scientific or material descriptions. He says this: the truth was that all I'd heard about the Eldil served to connect two things which in one's mind tend to keep separate. And that connecting gave one a sort of shock. We tend to think about non-human intelligences in two distinct categories, which we label scientific and supernatural, respectively. But the very moment we are compelled to recognize a creature in either class as real, the distinction begins to get blurred. Could be this, could be that. Scientifically, it is a thinking material. Theologically, it seems like and actually it's a bit of both. So what is he talking about? A fourth way of thinking, at a fourth dimension. The whole cosmos is involved in this. Now he's going to talk about that later on when he looks at the Eldila and sees it like it's moving towards him very quickly. Even though it's standing still, there's a movement, and you can't actually, your human eye, which sees in 3 dimensions, is not really able to see what you're seeing. And it seems so overwhelming to your senses that you're almost struck blind. It's like seeing God. Why would God's presence strike you blind? Because he's the light. It'd be like the light of the sun. Well, that's one way of looking at it. I think Lewis has a better explanation for it than that. There's a presence there which our creaturely limitations don't allow us to see without annihilating us. So the distinction between natural and supernatural, he goes on, in fact broke down. And when it had done so, one realized how great a comfort it had been. That is the distinction between natural and supernatural. That was helpful. Natural I could understand. Natural I could master. I could see myself above the natural. I have a natural body, but I could rationalize my being in a sense that saw the physical, bodily, limited thing as something I had power over. Now I have the supernatural and I have no power over it, and at the same time it's something physically in front of me. What do I do with this? Something greater than me is physically present to me, and I can't get away from it. What price we may have paid for this comfort in the way of false security and accepted confusion of thought is another matter. And that is, I think, the main purpose of Perelandra. On top of this encounter in Venus and the foiled attempt to pervert the Green Lady through a man who has been sent by Mal-Eldil to thwart this plot, because God has sent him there. We find out he was called there purposefully, actually back out of the Silent Planet. We're going to find out that he was sent there to learn the old solar to be able to communicate with the Green Lady. So there's a preparation that's been on. There's providence. There's an ordering of things. He's not ready for the later challenges until he's fulfilled the lower challenges. So again, the character of Ransom is changing. And we, the reader, are also changing, and we're recognizing there are spiritual forces at work in the world. In the novel, yes, but then you, by dint of analogy, think, does that apply to the here and now? Well, science fiction always is talking about contemporary culture. So do you also then see the spiritual powers, which are our true enemies, not flesh and blood, as Paul says in Ephesians 6, but the spiritual powers that are at work even in the physical world, do you see them now? And I think the effect of Lewis's work is to start to at least look for them. Even in the material, because he's blurred the categories now. He's done what Barfield suggests that language originally did. It saw those things and they didn't separate them and didn't, let alone break the connection between them. So he wants us to break down these categories and show that the world is not tame and predictable, but very disquieting. And he says this not a few sentences later. He says, and as I realized that, I was afraid of two things. Afraid that sooner or later I myself might meet an Eldil. This is Lewis talking. and afraid that I might get drawn in. I suppose everyone knows this fear of getting drawn in. Remember I said in the essay, the inner ring. Everybody wants to be in the inner ring. Right? There's this human temptation to be in the in crowd, to be with the cool kids. The cool kids table, whatever the insiders are, wherever group you are in a school or a club or in politics or whatever you want to be, like there's a further in where really you're going to be at the center of everything and nobody's going to exclude you. Very strong drive. But there's another sort of drive that you resist intensely, and that drive is the drive to avoid being drawn into the presence of God. And that resistance is caused by sin. You don't want to be drawn in. You're hostile to it. It's not just that you don't want it, it's that you hate the very idea that you're going to be drawn in, and you flee from it. He goes on to say, the moment at which a man realizes that what had seemed mere speculations are on the point of landing him inside the Communist Party or the Christian church, the sense that a door is just slammed and left him on the inside. The thing was such sheer bad luck. Ransom himself had been taken to Mars or Malacandra against his will and almost by accident, and I had become connected with his affair by another accident. So here's Lewis's problem. Lewis, who represents the reader, is we have heard about Ransom, and he's been drawn into adventure, and because we've read it, we've been drawn in. And now we're facing a dilemma, because we don't want in. Because at that point, something aside from yourself is directing your own destiny, which Ransom or Lewis here calls accident or fate or just chance. By the way, as he progresses, he moves away from the fatalistic, deterministic, accidental, chance, materialist view of things towards providential, directed, spiritually led life actions, which he sees everywhere. So it's a shift in sensibilities. And the characters undergo it, and so does the reader. I think it's quite brilliant. And it's enhanced by presenting the Eldials not as the good guys, but as a threat. Because that is how the sinful mind perceives all spiritual realities. It is a threat. It's a threat to what? Us being gods. It's greater than us. It's stronger than us. It's wiser than us. It's more knowledgeable than us. It's more powerful than us. It's immortal. What do? We want to run away. What if we can't run away? What if you're not looking for God, but God is after you? So this is very subtle. And when he throws the Christian church in there, it shows that arriving in church isn't just a mere speculation. It's something that you've been brought there at that point. So you think, well, I just happened to wander into the church this Sunday and then this happened to me. Well, actually, and from your perspective, of course, that's what happened, because you think that every choice that you make is of your own will, more or less, except, and you get kidnapped or so forth. But what if God is actually ordaining your whole life so that not a hair falls from your head without his will, etc.? What if that's the case? Because that's how Scripture presents it. And that awareness that is happening is what's happening here, but there's something very terrifying about that scenario. To the natural sinful creature who wants to be his own God and wants to master everything going on around him. So when he says that the door's been slammed shut and left him on the inside, everybody instantly remembers that terrible feeling if they've ever been locked in a closet by a nasty sibling or whatever. You can't get out, and it's the panic, right? That terrible. I mean, I'm not a claustrophobic, but anybody with that you don't even need to be claustrophobic. Being locked on the inside so that you can't get out in the dark, that's what he feels like. And there's something hostile about those on the inside. Even worse, this is horror novel type scenario. When you go back, if you read the book again, I've read it more than once, all of these references to luck and accident you see them as somebody trying to explain away what's clearly not luck or accidental, right? But that's you've changed your sensibilities by that point. At this point, you will accept it as luck or accident, although it doesn't seem adequate. That's why I say it's not an omniscient narrator. The narrator is faulty in the way he's explaining what is happening to him. A question or a comment?
Would Lewis go as far as to say that this is what the Bible refers to as predestination, or would he just simply say that it's God's will?
I think it's just God's will. I don't think this is predestination per se, because it's talking about individual events of life. Predestination is in relation to your final relation to God, in the eschaton. Before there was ever a sinner on earth, there was a Savior in heaven, and you were called, chosen, predestined. Okay, well, that's seeing it in terms of the outcome. This is the passage along the way to that outcome. So it's more not just looking at the end of all these things, it's looking at the right now. This is God's willing himself in my life right now. If he's omnipresent, if he's omniscient, if he answers to my calls when I pray, I'm commanded to pray. If we hear that he answers prayers and is eager to hear prayer, then he's involved in the here and now. Not just ultimately. An ultimate good is intended for me, even now. There's that aspect. So I think that is what's going on. But he presents very well, at least to my mind, you might not agree, there's a sort of a psychological distress in Lewis at this experience, which he probably remembers as a convert. And I remember as a convert, an adult convert. Something's going on here. And it's not just like it's pure bliss. Oh, this is great. You come in and everything, your life is better. It's just like, yeah, I'm not so sure about being here. Because I want to make sure that you people aren't just total crackpots and loonies. That's as an adult walking into a church in my late 20s after growing up in the United Church, but 15 years, I'm like, what the heck's going on here? I'm going to sit in the back row, and I don't want anyone to talk to me. And I'm just watching everything, and I am on my guard. Because I'm not sure that this isn't some sort of a cult that's going to pull me. No, I'm telling you. I don't know, but so it resonates with me is all I can say. Because you're aware that something is going on here which could be deeply wrong and malevolent. And it takes time for that and that sense of being slammed and left on the inside, that's it. Oh, shoot, I'm here now. Oh, well, I can always walk out. I can go. I think I remember saying that to people. Yeah, sure, I'll come along with you to church, but, I can always, if I don't like it, I'm just going to leave. Yeah, that's okay. Like, oh, I was hoping that was not the response I was hoping for. I was hoping, no, you can't do that. And then I just wouldn't come at all. So he develops this unease, and it's trying to show the distrust of the Eldils as part of the imbalance in him. It's realistic. And he realizes that he's left his backpack on the train. He says this, "Will you believe me when I say that my immediate impulse was to turn back to the station and to do something about it? So I wanted to get away from the situation I was in. I got to get that backpack." You invite somebody to church, they say they're coming, I'm coming, they don't show up. What happened? Well, you'll never believe it, but somebody phoned me. That actually happens. So if you invite somebody to a church, you have to go to the door and come with them along the way. I'm not saying it as a creepy coerce them, but there are going to be impediments to them coming there. I believe that. There are obstacles there, even there, to Christians going to church on a Sunday. Oh, well, I got this and that. More urgent. Can't do that. But there was an impulse to turn back to the station and do something about it. Of course, there was nothing to be done, which could not equally be done by ringing up from the cottage. But at the moment, it seemed perfectly obvious that I must retrace my steps, and I had indeed begun to do so before reason or conscience awoke and set me once more plodding forwards. In doing this, I discovered more clearly than before how very little I wanted to do it. It was such hard work that I felt as if we were walking against a headwind. Isn't that interesting? He cites two things here, by the way, reason and conscience. Reason contradicts his impulse to go back to the station. He wills it. He desires, I want to go back. Why does he want to go back? He's afraid. His reasoning says, that's a stupid thing to do. You don't have to go back to get your bag. You can just phone somebody up. So reason and the conscience that he's actually avoiding out of cowardice and not out of genuine fear, those two things. So there's something in there, and that voice of conscience and reason is what's going to guide Ransom through the whole of the challenges he's going to face until he finally fights the unman. His reason will speak to him, and so will his conscience, and he will be on both sides. And he talks about this in Mere Christianity. Two impulses. And they are now not just intellectual choices, they are moved by sin and by a desire, God's calling. And there is a war, a spiritual war going on there. That's how he presents it, but not as a spiritual war at this point, but just an internal battle, a struggle in his mind. Note he doesn't theologize it yet, but it becomes more theological as the story progresses. And he thinks that Ransom is, when he describes the earth as enemy-occupied territory held down by dark Eldils, he sees it in materialist terms. Like the bacteria on the microscopic level, so these co-inhabiting pests on the macroscopic permeate our whole life invisibly and are the real explanation of that fatal bent, which is the main lesson of history. That's his explanation for all this. And again, it's like the first installation of Star Wars, to some degree, right? It's the what do you call those stupid things again? I mentioned them already. That what? That midichlorian. It's awful, awful. So really, what's behind it all, the dark powers, isn't God. It's a little microscope. Where microscopic creatures are driving everything. Dumb on toast. Terrible in terms of fantasy. But he breaks that down, and he says basically he's going insane. He says they call it a breakdown at first, I thought. Wasn't there some mental disease in which quite ordinary objects looked to the patient unbelievably ominous? Looked, in fact, just as that abandoned factory looked to me now. Great bulbous shapes of cement, strange brickwork bogies, glowered at me over dry, scrubby grass, pockmarked with gray pools and intersected with the remains of a light railway. I felt I was getting nearer to the one enemy, the traitor, the sorcerer, the man in league with them, walking into the trap with my eyes open, like a fool. They call it a breakdown at first, said my mind, and send you to a nursing home. Later on, they move you to an asylum. He's fearful, he's doubtful, and he thinks he's actually losing his mind. He's not sure. Because he realizes that he's leaving the rationality of the herd and its explanation for everything and moving into a territory which defies their capacity to explain it. And he can't, and he fears the consequences of being an outsider to that group of which he used to belong and explain everything. Now, he describes this paranoia even from the outside. Then came a moment, the first one of absolute terror, and I had to bite my lip to keep myself from screaming. And he says, I have naturally no wish to enlarge on this phase of my story. I would have passed it over if I did not think that some account of it was necessary for a full understanding of what follows. And perhaps of some other things as well. In other words, Lewis the narrator is explaining to we, the reader, that his experiences in hearing the story are instructive to them as readers when they think about their own lives outside of it. That's why that's why Lewis is bothering to tell us this part of the story. And again, it like the frame narrative in Shelley's Frankenstein, where it begins with the scientist in the Arctic telling us his story and then encounters Victor Frankenstein on the ice floe, who tells us his story. And then within all of that, there's the narrative, the creature, the story there. We're on the outside of the story, and we keep getting sucked in to the middle of it. And that's what Lewis is doing here effectively. It's a frame sort of narrative at the front, but it is there to pull you in to the story and identify with it in ways that are now, it's going to be more than a story. It's going to be a meaningful experience. And he finds himself being pulled in, and he falls over. And it is presented exactly in terms of disorientation. It's senses, so he reaches around and he gropes, and it's dark. I groped a few paces forward, hit my shin violently against something, and fell. I sat still for a few seconds, nursing my leg. I thought I knew the layout of Ransom's hall, sitting room, pretty well, and couldn't imagine what I had blundered into. Presently, I groped into my pocket, got out my matches, tried to strike a light. The head of the match flew off. I stamped on it and sniffed to make sure it was not smoldering on the carpet. He's appealing to his senses to explain something that he can't explain with his senses. Like, I'm trying to, okay, I can smell it, I'm still rational. But what I'm encountering, I can't explain. There's nothing in the middle of the hallway there. What the heck did I just hit my shins on? Because it was there. There's something there that I can't explain. I rose gingerly and felt my way forward. I once came to an obstacle, something smooth and very cold, that rose a little higher than my knees. I groped my way along this to the left and finally came to the end of it. It seemed to present several surfaces, and I couldn't picture the shape. How can you picture 4 dimensions? That's what he's describing here. There's something like it, otherwise he could picture it. There's surfaces. It's not just the blind man and the elephant. You grab a leg, you grab the tusk, whatever. It's a different. No, he can't even picture the shape. It was not a table, for it had no top. One's hand groped along the rim of a kind of low wall, the thumb on the outside and the fingers down inside the enclosed space. So there's a touch, and for a moment he forgets the sense of the alien. And what he gets in by touching leads him not to stay there. He then falls into it. When I heard Ransom's name pronounced, then he hears something different. So he hears his name. Almost, but not quite simultaneously, I saw the thing I had feared so long to see. What I saw was simply a very faint rod or pillar of light. Since I saw the thing, I must obviously have seen it white or colored, but no efforts of my memory can conjure up the faintest image of what that color was. I tried blue and gold and violet and red, but none of them will fit. It was not at right angles to the floor. What one actually felt at the moment was that the column of light was vertical, but the floor was not horizontal. The whole room seemed to have heeled over as if it were on a board ship. Its mere presence abolished the terrestrial horizontal. I had no doubt at all that I was seeing an Eldil. Disoriented. People walking up, like, how do I, this is not three-dimensional, he's talking about Einstein's theory of relativity. Depends where you are, how you see that. How do I describe the presence of the Eldil? I am seeing an Eldil. Is it color? Is it light? Is it sound? It's all of those things. It's an experience of spiritual presence that defies our terminology. There's no mistake in Scripture when God is described. It uses symbolic language and also associations that don't make any sense. They defy our capacities to understand it. Remember the cherubim, Isaiah has the vision of the temple, and it's filled with the angels who are crying, holy, 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 and their eyes are covered and their wings, and they're moving in different directions all at once. Like, what's going on there? Multiple directions, all at once. That's what it's describing. The indescribable, a different dimension. So now he's caught in the experience of where the terrestrial horizontal is gone. It makes no sense. And so he has two alternatives. The world outside the cottage, the cold and the darkness, the place of doubt and mental instability, or the world inside the cottage, which is very, very dark and warm, where there's mental clarity and trustworthy perceptions, but on the other hand, there's an Eldil in there. So would I rather be out in the cold and the dark, or in the dark and the warm, where I can think clearly and see and perceive things, but at the same time, there's a presence of an Eldil there, and I'm not so sure about them. Are they safe? Again, it's like the presence of Aslan. Note that he doesn't draw any conclusions, he just describes the experience. He will come back to that at the end of Perelandra, when he goes up the mountain. And again, he describes a great cosmic dance going on here. But what he's describing here and what he's trying to do is, as I say, he's trying to baptize the imagination, to use his phrasing, and transpose so that we are resisting our conditioned materialism and evolutionary explanation of everything, and reduction of all spiritual things to material explanations, even though it's totally irrational. Which is my chief objection to evolution, by the way. I don't see how reason can come out of non-reason. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. It's not there in the thing before. How does it come after? It's a totally different thing. So that's the beginning of it, and at that point then he gets taken away. Now next time I'm going to talk about how that sense of a different dimension is important to then the narrative that happens on the planet of Perelandra, where we meet the Green Lead, and Weston will come along as well. But now we have a different landscape. It's not just two guys and a girl, right? One who's the sort of the poet type, just like in First Men in the Moon, and one is the scientist, and we have the alien. It will now include a sense of spiritual warfare happening, which is the perfect venue for temptation in the Garden of Eden. But again, the intro sets that all up, and it sets it up for us, the reader, as well. And then he's going to make judgments about modern science and the way it operates, but also about the tendency of spirituality to explain away the material. And with this in mind, Lewis will be thinking about all of the kooky 20th century New Agey spirituality, which detects spiritual things, but doesn't detect the fact that there are evil spirits as well as God. And Weston may as well be a hippie at this point. So he hasn't gone woke, but he's gone hippie. He's like, yeah, man, there's a spirit there, and you were right, and how could I not see it? And I'm totally with you, and I know exactly what you're talking about. So a spiritual war is there. And that would not have been introduced in the first work, but now he's ready for it. And when we come to the third, it's flat out, we understand what's going on there and expect it. And then he brings us into the present day. And that becomes very interesting, which is the modern university and what's going on in the modern university. We'll see that when we see it. Any comments or questions before we finish off today? Isn't it good? Okay, we'll see you then next time.